As we talk about investment in Central America, let's talk about El Salvador. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representatives, the foreign direct investment from private American companies to El Salvador in 2019 was about $3.4 billion. For the other Northern Triangle countries, it was $1.3 billion for Honduras and $746 million for Guatemala. That is compared to $860 billion in FDI that went to the Netherlands, the country that received the highest amount in 2019. Trailing them was the United Kingdom at $851 billion and Luxembourg at $766 billion. On the federal side, investment was on Vice President Kamala Harris's agenda as she toured Guatemala, where she talked about the importance of investing in agriculture.
One of the biggest bases for the economy in Guatemala is agriculture. If you have ever met or know a farmer, you have met some of the most innovative people in the world, because they have to adapt, because they have to be creative, because they have to be thoughtful about creating out a situation that may be unpredictable, something that is productive. So we are investing in Guatemala in that regard.
With me now, Dan Restrepo. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Tarini Parti is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Tarini, I want to start with you. While in Guatemala, Vice President Harris said the U.S. would invest $40 million over 3 years to launch an initiative for young, primarily indigenous women in Guatemala through USAID, which would provide an additional $48 million for affordable housing and agribusiness in the country. Why target that kind of investment, Tarini?
So the vice president's aides have been very clear that they want to focus on young women, the youth in the country, and the agriculture industry, including the coffee industry in that region. And the reason they want to focus on those kinds of investments is because they believe long-term, consistent investments in those industries, in those types of programs, could make a difference in terms of addressing the root causes of migration. And not only do they want the government to invest in those programs, but they're also calling on private sector investments in those industries in that region, because they believe that a consistent approach to this could make a difference and counter the sort of imbalance we've seen in foreign aid from the U.S. to these countries. As administrations change, as control of Congress can change, policies toward these countries have been changing, as well as a fluctuation in U.S. foreign aid to these countries.
Right. Dan, the vice president spoke about how these problems cannot be solved over the course of a 2-day visit. Of course, let's take a listen.
But you can't say you care about the border without caring about the root causes, without caring about the acute causes, which include the fact that you're looking at populations, in particular from Central America, who are plagued by hunger and the devastation caused by the hurricanes and, of course, the effect of the pandemic.
I want to add a piece there, Dan, and get your take on it, which is government corruption. Right? I mean, the partners that they have here are not necessarily the partners that they want. How do they root out and work around that piece?
By making civil society, kind of local organizations that are working on the ground, their partners of choice. The governments are the partners of necessity, and they need to, quite frankly, work with them the least amount possible. I think the administration gets that, and that the real change agents in these countries are folks who spend every day working to make these more sustainable societies, often against very deeply entrenched powers that be that stand in their way, that are often aligned with the government. So it's really a question of how the U.S. uses its money and how it uses its political and diplomatic weight, vice how much money the United States is bringing to bear.
Tarini, you've reported that aides to Vice President Harris have said the administration hopes to reduce these countries' reliance on U.S. foreign aid and boost involvement from the private sector and nonprofits as a way to circumvent corrupt governments, part of what Dan was talking about there. How do they see that being done, and what threshold determines when these countries are no longer in need of this aid?
I think that's a tough question in terms of how long this might take. And what they're trying to do here is bring in the private sector. So the vice president recently announced commitments from 12 companies to invest in these countries. And a lot of those investments were in infrastructure in those countries. So, for example, Microsoft is going to be investing in access to broadband. So, that's a start. And a lot of these companies have been reluctant to invest in the region in the past because of the corruption. So the government now believes that with these anti-corruption measures that the vice president announced, including a anti-corruption task force led by the Justice Department, that they can sort of work with these companies in the private sector to boost investment and also perhaps tackle corruption, which is going to be a much more difficult and long-term issue.
Dan, I don't need to tell you that there's the policy piece of this and then there's the politics piece of this. And one of the many places where those two areas overlap is that I think the administration has to be able to point to some results and some successes, which is incredibly challenging because we're talking about complex problems and we are talking about long-term sustained investment. What are those markers they can set along the way, both to measure the policy, but also to make sure that they are maintaining the political viability of these investments?
No, absolutely. And it's a delicate balance. I think a couple of things. One is on the humanitarian side, right? We heard the vice president talking about acute causes and root causes. Addressing the immediate food insecurity in Central America is something that you can measure. And that U.S. assistance can help move the needle on very quickly. Similarly, vaccination rates in these countries are abysmal, particularly in Guatemala and Honduras, where less than 0.5% of the population has been vaccinated. The U.S. has announced its intention to send vaccines downrange and prioritize these countries. It's another place. Again, that's on the acute side. In terms of the root cause, some of this is, again, how do you bring pressure to bear on these corrupt elites? And that'll be counted in terms of the number of visas revoked and the number of folks who's had financial sanctions against them in the United States. The elites in these countries, the thing they fear the most is having to live, work, and do business exclusively in their own countries, and the U.S. government needs to use that against them.